Welcome to Intake. If you haven't already, why don't you hit the subscribe button and then the notification button, so each time we drop an episode, you will be notified. It's time to shine the light from a mental health perspective. Welcome back to Beneath It All in the African American Community, Episode 2, Part 1. Hi, ladies.
Hi, Bertha.
Hi. So, Dr. Edmondson, why don't you give us some background information on yourself?
Hi, I'm Dr. Edmondson. I'm a counseling psychologist by training. Been in the field for over 30 years. Little specializations around women, addiction, trauma, sexual abuse. Do a little teaching at a couple of the major universities around town. And I thought this was a great project because it's important that we kind of get an understanding of where perhaps the cultural mistrust maybe stems in terms of the African American community. Even today in the 2020, we still have the racial disparities. We still have people that just do not trust the medical society, especially along the terms of the pandemic that we are currently experiencing. Another ram of this is that what's going on in our society is it's given a lot of stress, anxiety, depression. So all of it together, is colliding.
There is a long history of cruelty and mistreatment toward African Americans in Western society that continues to persist. Since the kidnapping of 12.5 million people from Africa between 1525 to 1866, with only 10.7 million surviving the terrifying 2-month journey. People of African descent have suffered in numerous of ways across the country. The historical beliefs pulsating racism and hatred continues to control the thoughts of many, with racial assumptions, race-illicit emotions, and ongoing false racial biases that targets and threatens the lives of people of color.
I'm just going to offer a brief thumbnail of the early possible contributions that may have led to the cultural mistrust among African Americans in the medical society. I'm just going to highlight a few of the experiments that were conducted today, that these experiments would truly be unethical. Even when I was reading these experiments, my heart was just overwhelmed with it. But Harriet Washington, she was among some of the people that revealed the starting part of medical experimentation among African Americans during slavery. She started sharing how African American bodies were targeted. And they first started targeting the African Americans by doing experiments, dissecting, using African Americans on autopsies. This is how the medical students started to learn. They started to learn using our bodies. To our culture, this is disgusting. And there were a number of racist opinions that I was reading in these articles that were written that characterized us as untrustworthy. We were known to be sexually promiscuous. We were mentally ill-equipped. This type of treatment made us fearful. And I also want to just say that I spent some time reading a book, and I'm sure most of you probably read this book or have heard it, 12 Years a Slave. And just listening, and I'm listening to it on audio, and just the horrendous beatings that we had to undergo, and all of the sexual acts that was on the plantation. We didn't even have any rights. So that's just one. Now let me note another important experiment of Thomas Hamilton. He attempted to create medication to treat the effects of heat stroke. Now down here today in Florida, it's 103 degrees. I couldn't imagine working on a plantation all day and all night at 103 degrees. But he used a male slave and he placed him in a pit with only his head exposed. He was given a variety of formulas with the intent that after each dose, he would faint, but then he tried to revive him. Now this was conducted to see if you could bring a person back after having a heat stroke.
John Brown was an enslaved African American loaned to Hamilton to pay off a debt. He was placed in the pit 5 or 6 times over 3 weeks and administered medication to determine which allowed him to withstand the heat best. The purpose of the experiment was to show that slaves could work longer hours even on the hottest of day. Hamilton was determined to prove that blacks and whites were physiologically different. One of his theories were that blacks' skin were thicker than whites. Physicians in Hamilton era believed that blacks had larger sex organs and smaller skulls and sought to prove their theory that blacks were more sexual, promiscuous, and less intelligent. Brown eventually escaped and was considered a runaway slave. Brown lived out his life in England and wrote Slave Life in Georgia, a narrative of the life, suffering, and escape of John Brown, a fugitive slave now in England, and shares the horrible experience of being blistered all across his body. Brown made a living as a herbalist before his death in 1876.
Now let's just look at the experiments that were done on the African American women's bodies. Let's not forget the painful OBGYN operations using 3 women slaves from Alabama. These women had to undergo painful operations to help prepare their vagina. These operations were conducted without any anesthesia. And one doctor noted in an article that I read, the poor girl I operated on was Lucy. There was no anesthesia. She was on her knees. She suffered through the operation. She was heroic. She was brave. Here's my own summary of that operation. No wonder African American women are always characterized as being strong. Here was a woman that was undergoing a painful operation with no anesthesia. Now, when they started to develop the anesthesia, who was it given to? The white women. My thoughts there. How dare them? That's a double standard. Now, all of this fear, because as you know, word of mouth spread widely through the slave communities. That's the only way that they knew all of this information.
Sims is known to be the father of gynecology after his experiments on enslaved women and girls from 1846 to 1849. He is also known for establishing some gynecological tools. According to History.com, only 3 of the women's names are known to date: Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. Lucy was an 18-year-old girl who Sims operated on for 1 hour without any anesthesia. Sims later wrote in his autobiography, The Story of My Life, Lucy's agony was extreme. I thought she was going to die. It took Lucy 2 to 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of the operation. Anarcha was a 17-year-old girl who Sims operated on 30 times. After 4 years of experimenting on enslaved women and girls without anesthesia, Sims began operating on white women using anesthesia. Sims' logic for not using anesthesia or any numbing methods were due to his belief that blacks did not feel pain like whites did. Why is it that the many enslaved women and girls who Sims experimented on were not given credit for their sacrifice if indeed the experiments were innocent and beneficial to future medicine? Know their names.
I forget the Mississippi appendectomy, sterilization of African American women. Most of us are familiar with the Tuskegee experiment. Even though there was an antibiotic, a dosage, it was never administered. Not until 1940. These poor people, these poor men went through the syphilis and most of them died through it. There's no wonder we in our community are afraid of the white medical doctors. It started all the way back, that cultural mistrust. In 1840, excuse me, they deliberately falsified insanity rates among African Americans. Now, when slaves tried to run away, they tried to put fear in them, saying if you try to go away run to the north, it was known as drapomania. They were trying to control the escape of slaves. But as I started reading even more and more this week, slaves had a great understanding. There was more better opportunities in the North because they started, again, the word through word of mouth. They didn't have telephones and emails at that time, but they had the word of other people that had been different places. And what person would want to continue to live in slavery, be punished? So they did try to escape, but they were whipped. They were put into fear that if you try to leave here, you wouldn't survive, and that you would go crazy if you tried to live somewhere else in the North.
The U.S. Sixth Census of 1840 was falsified to show that people of African descent were better off as slaves. Insanity rates were 10 times higher among free blacks than enslaved blacks. The falsifying of the numbers were to show that freedom was mentally debilitating for blacks and slavery was preventative for anxiety and other mental illnesses. After writing about the benefits slavery had on blacks, Dr. Edward Jarvis began noticing significant discrepancies in the census number after realizing there were a greater number of insane free blacks than the total number of blacks in certain states. Jarvis fought for the correction to be made but failed after Vice President John Calhoun insisted the numbers were proof that blacks were not mentally fit for freedom. Today, those false numbers remain as part of the 1840 U.S. Sixth Census.
So the system started, and I'm just going to sum it up as the system was shaped by cultural mistrust. We know that all the way back from slavery. It still has a lot of cultural mistrust in terms of the medical society. And even though we are in the 2020, we still have mistrust medically, we got mistrust politically. I mean, it's all over. But I think some of those researches, things that happened, those experiments back in that time, they're still fearful because people still talked about it. We read about it. A lot of it was not in our history, and I didn't know a lot of these experiments existed until I started looking at the cultural mistrust. There's no misunderstanding that we have the cultural mistrust. And there's no misunderstanding that we have to get out and start to educate our culture. We have to share what our knowledge, and this is a great platform to start to do that.
Dr. Edmondson, thank you so much for that history. I know when I was doing the research on this so-called father of gynecology, Dr. Sims, apparently Dr. Sims not only experimented on slave women, but also children. And his method behind not using anesthesia, because apparently anesthesia was already established. Doctors, however, in that time didn't trust the anesthesia. But Dr. Sims' explanation for not using the anesthesia was based on the fact that he believed that Black people didn't experience pain the same way that white people experience it. And so when I looked up the research, read all the articles, I have to say I agree with you. I was simply disturbed behind everything that I was reading. I don't know how any human could not be disturbed. Unfortunately, as I read articles where individuals were trying to justify why he did it, and because in American history, he's seen as a hero because he started this gynecological practice, but however, he started on slaves. And I read an article that said the women were in pain because, you know, they had this condition after women give birth where the uterus kind of falls out. So one article said, well, I'm sure that these women were in such pain that they didn't care whether he experimented or not on them. First of all, the women didn't have a choice because they were property. And as property, you can't give consent. Your owner gives consent. These women also were viewed as those who were able to produce workers. But not only that, they were known as those who were supposed to reproduct so that more slaves could be born. So, you know, so there was no consent involved. So I don't know how you can give consent when technically the law back then, because you were property, you had no voice. So there is an argument on whether or not these women were able to give consent, which I find disturbing.
Well, I find it, although I know the history, I find it quite disturbing to listen to it all over again. It was the way, you know, slavery was an economic action plan. So being commodity, you know, slaves being commodity, there were vast amounts of opportunity to experiment, to advance whatever their personal agendas were. So it's inconceivable to think about how someone endured such levels of pain, right? And how inhumane it was and what it does to a woman, much less a woman of color, a woman, period. If you can just take the opportunity to think that through, having menstrual cycles are painful. Having, giving birth was extremely painful. And I was, you know, I was one of those mothers that wanted to not have epidural because I wanted to give birth. I cannot conceive what the level of pain must have been like. But what's more difficult for me to even understand is how someone does that to another person and finds justification in their being to say that this is okay. So yes, you think we're talking about a time that was before, and people will say, well, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about this now? This is not happening now. But the legacy of that torture still exists. It exists in the spirit, it exists in the mind. And this is why today it is very difficult for some people of color to absolutely trust that they are going to be treated as a 100% human being with full respect, with care. And this is what we are addressing today. And I work in a hospital, and this disparity in the way that people of color are treated still exists today. It may not be as horrific as it was then, but it is still neglect. It is still, we're still disenfranchised. People are physicians. I mean, I've seen it. I work in it. And, you know, there's money. $8 billion was poured into New York State alone to change the healthcare system. So trust me, it is still existing today. That's the relevance of this conversation.
Gina, I'm glad that you mentioned that because, again, remember I said Dr. Sims, his belief was that people of African descent did not feel pain like their white counterparts. A research also done in 2016 by the University of Virginia shows that even now the perceptions of Caucasian doctors and doctors outside of the African culture still believe that African Americans don't feel the same pain that their white counterparts do. So when an African American goes into the doctor and they're in pain, they're not treated the same as their white counterpart, because there is still this belief that our pain tolerance is much higher than those in the European culture. So I'm glad that you said that, because we do see that happening. And again, that's the mistrust. As I was saying earlier, this same Dr. Sims, because the purpose of doing this, a lot of people say, why go back and look at all of this? Because the truth be told, unless we start with history, we can't fix where we are now, by no means, but we can also move further into the future. Because if we can never see the mistakes that were made in history, what we keep doing is we repeat them. And so there is a perception that has been established in Western society regarding African Americans. And hopefully this will break that perception, because there's research out there that's showing that it exists. We see it exist every day that we turn on the news. Dr. Sims also did experiments on African American children. And he did these experiments on their brain because he also believed that African Americans were less intelligent than white people. And what he did was he used, you all know, the shoemaker's tool to pry their bones apart and loosen their skull, okay? So he did some excruciating surgery on African American babies. His idea was not only that we didn't feel same, we didn't have the same pain tolerance as Europeans, but we also weren't as intelligent. And I believe that that still exists in Western society. I told you all before, I know for myself, I have gone to the doctor and I've had to fire a couple of doctors because I'm not ashamed. I've had to fire a couple of doctors because I realized that when I go see a Caucasian doctor who is not skilled in multiculturalism, what he does or she does is they talk at me instead of with me. And they don't give me that attention that I need when I'm in the room to explain what it is that's going on with me. So for me, quickly, that's a red flag, and I exit out and never come back. And then until I can find a doctor that can acknowledge me as the human that I am. So I think we need to start talking about these issues because there is a history. But this history, again, has bleeded over into our current state now. And unless we have these discussions, we will not, again, learn from it. We'll never be able to move forward.
Well, I have to, I definitely agree with the comments made earlier. It's to conceive this is very painful, even on just looking at it from a woman's perspective. Now, in order for us to move forward, and hence why we're here today, we've got to look at history. We've got to have an understanding of where we've come from, what that experience has been like for African American, and how we're going to move forward. We've got to have a thorough discussion and understanding on the medical community as it relates to African Americans during slavery. We were indeed commodity. We were traded as such. We were treated less than, mistreated, abused. Women were raped. They had no say when it came to their body parts. There was no such thing as pain. There was no such thing as going to the doctors. And a lot of times we relied on medicine that was out in the fields. We relied on the elderly, our parents, to pass down herbal medicines. Those things were not available to people of color during slavery. We didn't get sick. So today we look at history. It's hard. It's hard for a lot of us to go to the doctor and believe the diagnosis, believe in the medication that they give us, or believe that we're going to get well. And oftentimes we're not treated equally. Yeah. Not treated equally in the medical field.
Yeah, but we're all mental health professionals. And so we all know that there is also a history as far as mental health. I talked about it before in another episode with my former co-host, and we talked about this long history behind these interventions that we use. Even now, the current interventions that we use, they were created for white males. And so a lot of times, even as mental health professionals, we have to kind of adjust these interventions and be creative when we're dealing with African-American individuals. Do you not agree?
Yes.
And yes, Dr. Edmondson, yeah. And so there were also experiments from that aspect. And I don't know if you all have heard about it, but the New York Times was the first one to write this article about the experiments done in the 1990s on these African-American boys. And there was an experiment done to try to show that criminal behavior was genetically inherited. And what they did was they found these African boys by looking at the court records of their older brothers. As early as the 1990s, 100 African American and Hispanic boys between the ages of 6 and 10 were used in an experiment to prove the hypothesis that criminal behavior can be predicted by certain chemical levels, and thus criminal behavior is genetically inherited. The boys were taken off all of their medication, including their asthma medicine, and administered fenfluramine, which as early as 1989, research showed the drug to cause severe neurotoxicity. When given to animals, the drug was shown to overstimulate and kill serotogenic brain cells. They were also fed a low-protein diet, withheld water, and given hourly blood draws. Fenfluramine is known to increase serotonin levels. Increased serotonin levels have been associated with aggressive and violent behavior. When fenfluramine is administered with a low-protein diet, it can also cause a number of health risks. So they convinced these parents to allow the boys to stay at this space that they were experimenting in without their parents. So they gave them fenfluramine, which is also known as fen-phen, which was a drug that we know to be a diet pill. This drug has a history of being dangerous. They knew it was dangerous before they gave it to the boys. The idea was that what fen-phen does is it adjusts the chemicals in your brain. And so it messes with the serotonin. And we know when serotonin levels aren't right, there is a tendency to be angry, irritable, all of that. And the idea was to show that, look, criminal behavior is genetic. And so when we look at the history, we have to address these things because there are so many experiments. And if we talked about all the experiments that were done on slaves, on African Americans, the experiments, to be honest, that are still being done on African American men who are in jail, we could go on for months. And so we have to talk about these issues because they're important to moving forward. They're important to making sure that the next whomever we put into this space called the White House is willing to make some changes for us. Because we know that our current climate, with the current climate that's going on today, there's a lot of things that's happening. And people are questioning. Why are so many making George Floyd a hero when he was a criminal? Why the protest? Why now? Why this particular incident? What is this really all about? And they fail to realize it's not about him being a criminal. It's not about making him a hero. It's about the history, an ongoing history of mistreatment. And until we can face the issues that African Americans have experienced in Western society, we'll never be able to identify truth.
I think your point is valid, it's well taken. I know from a larger scope of things, we don't have that reach, but from a smaller scope of things, we do have the reach in terms of being to be able to educate people. For example, we're all in different places. So we can take our knowledge of this, pass it on, present the information. I mean, I know we're in a pandemic and things are getting in the way of that. But as I'm listening to you, I think, and everybody here, the information needs to be shared among people that'll listen. This is a time because people are listening and they do want change, similar to what we are doing. We're looking at this and we know that history is there. And we've outlined that history. And I think we take small bits of the history, we give it to people so people can really understand. And then we just continue to try to pass this information along. As we know, education is knowledge and powerful, right? Let's just use the example, like you said, about the doctor. There is research out there, a study, and it's at where did I write that? I think it's at Georgetown University. It is, and it says blatantly in this research, it's in the New England Journal of Medicine, and their findings suggest that many physicians practicing today still hold prejudice, which we know what might prevent them from adequately treating African American clients. So we know that that's there. But we can advocate for ourselves. Like you said, Bertha, you could get up and go find 6 or 7 somebody else. But then we've got the people in communities and neighborhoods that can't do that. They're not, they don't know to do that. Let me just say that. They don't know that they can change doctors when you don't feel your voice is being heard, when you don't feel that you're being treated. You don't know that. They think that let's just use on Medicare or whatever. They believe that whatever that doctor says is a valid word. And that may not be true. They don't know that they can go get a second or third opinion.
I agree. The idea of, let me just say this, because I heard you, Dr. Edmondson. Let me just say this with intake. My reach is small now, but I'm the kind of person that's determined enough to make it as broad and as wide as I can make it. And one thing I've learned about individuals is they would rather watch a video than to do the research. A lot of people. That's people across the board. This is why intake is here, because if I can get a simple video out to the public, to individuals who can't pay for HBO, to individuals who can't afford Netflix, but I can get it to them on a simple platform like YouTube, and take a person like Yvonne and she shares this video with her crew, and Gina shares it with her crew, and the next person shares with their crew, then we can reach pretty far. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea, because we want to reach as many people as possible to educate them and help them understand that you have a choice. And that's society has trained us that as brown-skinned people, we have to settle. And we have to break the conditioning to know that, look, I may be in a low-income neighborhood. And if it's Medicaid, whatever, unless you're on HMO, but if it's Medicaid, I'm sorry. If it's Medicaid, whatever, you have a choice. And you should be treated like the human that you are, regardless of skin color. Mm-hmm. Now, I need to clear this up, because I know I'm going to get some rhetoric from a lot of people. Because by no means am I saying let's not trust those in the helping field. Let's just say that. My daughter is a doctor. What I'm hoping is that we can get more African American doctors. There are a lot of European doctors who do understand culture. There are a lot who don't want to understand it. So it's important to educate yourself and be aware of those who don't see you as equal, as a human. It's important to educate yourself with that. There are great doctors out there from all cultures, but there are so many that just don't get it. And they don't get it because we live in a society that has conditioned us to believe a certain way, even about ourselves. If you're a professional who would like to be on the show, or an individual who has struggled with mental health and would like to be a guest, email us at info@intake.tv.
Follow us on all of our social media platforms.
Intake Talk Show, making mental health a priority by changing the way the world views it. To learn more about Intake or one of our guests, visit our website at intake.tv.